It was 1970 in New York City, and my memorable co-leader, Henry Spitz, came up to me and said, "You have to read this book. It is the cookbook of group psychotherapy." He was right. All of the ingredients and directions were there to bake a group. Can you imagine learning about group therapy without the book, The Theory and Practice of Group Psychotherapy? It was revolutionary at the time. It had no jargon or new fancy words to learn. It was written so clearly that anyone of normal intelligence could understand it. And it was fun and entertaining with stories that anyone could identify with. Before the internet, Irv brought knowledge of group therapy to a global audience. Despite the fact that we keep trying, none of us has ever come close to being able to do this. Did you know that there is a Yalom Group Therapy Institute in China? Irv sold 700,000 books, and it has been translated into 12 languages. It has 5 editions, and with the help of Molin Lesh, it is always up to date with the latest innovations in our field. Irv is so up to date that I learned people are doing text group therapy in the United States and China. Irv is one of those people who can be the first to do things, an innovator. Aside from his book on group therapy, as a resident at Johns Hopkins, he was the first to lead a group for sex offenders in an agency in Baltimore. At Stanford, it was really a stretch for Irv to do a group with cancer patients and dying patients. Even though it was hard for him, it led to his book on existential psychotherapy. Typically, he stretched, he learned, and then he shared what he learned with the rest of us. Irv assured me that after his memoir comes out, that he's working on, there is nothing we won't know about him. So what is the formula that produces such a brave and unique leader, aside from innate talent and intelligence? It starts out with uneducated Jewish immigrant parents who live and work in a poor black ghetto in Washington, D.C. It is segregated, so Irv plays with the neighborhood kids and then goes to the white schools. He has a mother who never says a kind word to him, but works her butt off so that he can study and become a doctor. His uncle refers to him as the king because he gets to study while the rest of the family can't stop to rest. Then come mentors who think outside the box, such as Jerome Frank and Rollo May. The formula involves getting straight A's along with dozens of other Jewish boys prepped to be doctors and competing for the 5 out of 100 spots in medical school. The quota of Jews was 5%. Then last but not least, the formula includes a 15-year-old adolescent boy meeting an exciting, sophisticated young woman who knows the way to success and grooms him with love for the rest of his life. And now I want to present this plaque with our heartfelt appreciation to the absolutely one and only Dr. Irv Yalom.
So much, and thank you so much from all of you at AGPA for honoring me in this way. It's a great honor. I'm very, very touched by it. My contact with the organization goes back a very long way. I went to medical school graduated from medical school in 1956, and then I took an internship at Mount Sinai, and then I started my residency at at Johns Hopkins at Baltimore, and that was my first contact with group therapy. I had a very gifted, quite a wonderful teacher there named Jerome Frank, who was at that point the only person really I knew that was really experimenting with groups. And he had this newfangled two-way mirror that we could all look through, and there were about 8 of us residents, and there was a mirror that was about so big. So we had our 8 heads in a circle around there, all our heads butting against the other. But most of the others lost interest after a few weeks, so I was the only one left after observing his groups. And at the end of the year, Jerry Frank was asking me to lead his group when he was out of town. So I learned a great deal from him, and he wrote one of the very early, certainly research books about group therapy. After my residency, I went in the Army. Had a free hand there. Was sent to the unfortunate assignment in Hawaii, where I led groups of the inpatients there, and also the officers' wives, and also a group of residents, civilian residents, and did my first kind of process group for helping residents to learn how to learn about group therapy and interact with one another. Very difficult group to lead, I've learned since then, because self-disclosure there is doubly kind of difficult. They're not only revealing to others their own character structure, but they're also revealing, in a sense, their own competence, and that makes these type of groups hard to lead. The only way to really lead them is for the leader to be very self-disclosing himself or herself. All this time, though, after the Army, I went to Stanford and started to write my first articles about group therapy, and began finding that the organization that was really most relevant to me was AGPA. American Journal of Psychiatry almost never published an article about group therapy, and I regularly attended the group therapy meetings here in New York every other year, and elsewhere wherever they went for a long time at that point. And I can remember some of the first studies I did about group therapy. I followed Jerry Frank's advice and had the residents watch me in a therapy group when I first came to Stanford. So we had about 10 residents watching. It was part of their assignment. They groaned at having to spend a couple hours a week on group therapy, but they all did that. And after a few weeks, they began to get involved with the stories of the people, and at first they were refusing to come or leaving early, but then they began to get more interested in the narratives of each of these patients, and there was pretty good attendance after that. They called it Yalom's Peyton Place, after the soap opera that was so popular in those days, where you get caught up in patient stories. And after that, then the residents all led groups and had supervisors, and I had a chairman at Johns Hopkins named Dave Hamburg, who was a marvelous chairman, gave me total freedom to just do what I wanted to do in the group. So we had about 30 groups in the clinic there, and each of the residents was having a supervisor, and it was a invaluable source of research possibilities for me. So all the early research that I did and published in the International Journal of Group Psychotherapy was done from these groups, and I would present them each year at the annual meetings, and got to know them, the members of the association, quite well at that time. So I began to initiate a several-pronged teaching program for residents at Stanford. First of all, there was, as I mentioned, the watching of my group, but then also I had them all in a group for themselves, a process group of residents. And they met for an hour and a half a day, an hour and a half a week. And as I mentioned earlier, those aren't easy groups to lead, and eventually I did it for a few years, but I thought it'd be better to have someone who is not in the same organization, who's not going to be responsible for grading, if you will, or at least writing them letters in the future. So it'd be so I had other therapists from the area doing that. In addition to that, in addition to the T group, the residents all started to do a group of their own, and we organized supervisors for each of that. I continued leading different types of groups, and after a while, I was starting to move into another area. I wanted to combine some of the wisdom from philosophy into our field of psychotherapy. I felt that psychotherapy, as we often thought, starting in the late 1890s when Freud first came upon the scene, he was not only the first introduction of psychoanalysis, but he really introduced the whole field of psychotherapy. There was no one before Freud who did that. But at any rate, I felt that there was a great deal of wisdom about the way human beings thought and the way they were organized and the way they grew ill psychologically that is evident in philosophers who've been writing about this for the last 3,000 years, and thought that wanted to try to take and glean some of the philosophical wisdom and put it to our field and think of an existential approach. So I started working on how I would go about writing that book, and that the part of that, the most important part of that, would be our confrontation with death. And I had a difficulty of really helping people talk about death in their individual sessions, and I felt that I really needed to work with people who had to talk about death, who were facing a terminal cancer. And after meeting with them for a few months, it seemed to me they were so isolated. Often people with a fatal illness are doubly isolated. They isolate themselves from others. They don't want to be talking about their agony all the time because it drags everyone down. And then others isolate them because they don't want to disturb them. They don't know whether they should talk about their illness or not talk about that. So I began organizing groups for cancer patients. And this was a tremendously trying and also extremely illuminating endeavor. And I did these groups for about 10 years. And much of the material that I gleaned from them went into a textbook on existential psychotherapy. And one last group endeavor that I struggled with for a long time was leading groups on the inpatient ward. Once the pattern of hospitalization changed after Reagan, Ronald Reagan's presidency, the time that people spent in an inpatient unit was severely limited. Rather than being there for weeks or months, they were in there for days, which meant that almost every day the constituency of each group was different. Somebody new had come in, somebody had left, and I struggled to find a way of leading therapy groups in an inpatient setting, mainly changing it so that we were going to have a group that lasted one day, not expecting the same group would meet again the next day, and try to figure out how we could make that group most valuable. I worked with that, and worked also with observers in the group, and then made the observers part of the group by having the patients watch the observers' comments. I also did that with the psych residents in my own groups too. I know one of the early studies that we did a large encounter group study at Stanford with a friend of mine named Mort Lieberman, a very large group of all these T groups and encounter groups that were very proliferous all through the Palo Alto and California area. So we studied a lot of different types of these groups and did a large study which resulted in a big book called Encounter Groups First Facts, but presented that at the AGPA. Unfortunately, it was scheduled at the same time that Masters and Johnson were talking about their initial sex research. They had about 500 or 1,000 people for their discussion. I think we had about 12 or 13 on the group therapy research, but so I've been grateful to this organization. I was in close contact with them. After about 8 years at Stanford, I began to feel like there really wasn't a good group therapy textbook in the field. And I began thinking of the lectures I was giving to the residents and the research I was doing. So I took off a year sabbatical and started writing a group therapy textbook. I spent a year at the Tavistock Clinic in London. So that's where I wrote most of the first edition of my group therapy textbook. Had several editions after that. And Molin Lesh joined me on the 5th edition. And I've just learned over the last month or two that he and I are going to do another edition of this, and we'll start working on it in just a few months. So I'm looking forward to renewing my contacts with AGPA. So thank you again for this great honor. I'm very much touched and pleased by it. Thank you.